For nearly a week, back-channel signals out of Tehran had been pointing in one direction. Iranian officials, through intermediaries in Oman and Qatar, were quietly indicating they wanted a pause. Not a surrender, not a formal treaty, just an off-ramp, a way to stop the bleeding after weeks of losses that had visibly rattled the regime's confidence. Regional diplomats described the tone from Iranian negotiators as noticeably different from earlier in the conflict, less defiant, more focused on finding language both sides could live with. And then, in the middle of that quiet diplomatic opening, the Pentagon did something that had nothing to do with negotiating language at all. It moved additional carrier strike group assets into the region, repositioned long-range bomber capability within reach of Iranian territory, and authorized a posture that defense officials described, carefully, as designed to make clear that any pause in fighting would happen from a position of American strength, not American hesitation. Iran asked for room to talk. The Pentagon answered with more firepower parked closer to Iran's coastline than at almost any other point in this conflict. I'm going to walk you through exactly what Iran was signaling, what the Pentagon actually moved into place in response, and why that specific sequence, a peace signal met with a show of force rather than a matching diplomatic gesture, tells you more about how this conflict is likely to end than almost anything else that's happened in recent weeks. Stay with me, because there's a detail about the timing of this deployment that most coverage is completely missing. Before I get into the sequence of events, I want to be upfront about how I'm approaching a story like this one, because diplomatic signals are inherently harder to verify than a missile strike or a satellite photo. And it's easy for a story like this to drift into speculation dressed up as insider knowledge. My background is in strategic posture and military diplomacy, specifically how force deployments are used as signaling tools alongside or instead of formal negotiation. That's the lens I'm using here. Where something is confirmed by multiple regional or defense officials, I'll say so plainly. Where it's genuinely still developing or disputed, I'll tell you that too. Let's get into what we actually know. To understand why Iran's peace signal matters as much as it does, you have to understand the position the regime found itself in after weeks of sustained military pressure. Iran's leadership had spent years building a strategic posture around the assumption that its network of regional proxies, its underground infrastructure, and the sheer cost of any American-led campaign against it would be enough to deter serious, sustained conflict in the first place. That assumption had visibly failed. Facilities long considered untouchable had been struck. Naval and air assets had been degraded. Regional proxy networks that were supposed to provide Iran leverage and deniability had absorbed serious losses of their own. Against that backdrop, a quiet diplomatic feeler through Omani and Qatari intermediaries, floating the idea of a negotiated pause rather than continuing to absorb losses indefinitely, is a meaningfully different posture than the defiant rhetoric that had defined most of Iran's public messaging up to that point. It's worth understanding why Oman and Qatar, specifically, are the channels this kind of outreach tends to run through. Both governments have spent years deliberately cultivating a role as trusted intermediaries capable of talking to Washington and Tehran simultaneously, maintaining working relationships with both sides precisely so that exactly this kind of quiet, deniable back channel exists when either party needs it. Oman, in particular, has a long history of facilitating sensitive American-Iranian contacts going back well over a decade, including quiet groundwork that eventually contributed to previous rounds of nuclear diplomacy. That existing infrastructure of trust is precisely why Iran's outreach in this instance was read as credible by American officials, rather than dismissed as a stalling tactic. Because the channel itself carries a track record that lends the message real weight, independent of the specific language Iranian negotiators used this time. Regional diplomats familiar with the back-channel contacts described Iranian negotiators as focused less on securing specific concessions and more on simply establishing a framework for de-escalation floating language around a mutual pause, tied to specific, limited conditions rather than the kind of sweeping demands Iran had attached to earlier diplomatic gestures throughout the conflict. That shift in tone, from maximalist demands to something closer to a genuine off-ramp, is exactly the kind of signal that would normally be met, at minimum, with a reciprocal diplomatic gesture from Washington, some public acknowledgement that the door was open, paired with continued military pressure to maintain leverage during talks. That is not what happened here. Here's what the Pentagon actually did instead. Within roughly 72 hours of the back-channel signals reaching Washington through regional intermediaries, defense officials confirmed the repositioning of an additional carrier strike group into the broader region, placing it within operational range of the Gulf and the Arabian Sea alongside existing naval assets already committed to the conflict. Separately, officials confirmed that long-range bomber assets, the same category of aircraft involved in some of the most significant strikes of this entire campaign, were placed on a readiness posture that regional trackers described as consistent with preparation for renewed strike operations, rather than a routine rotation. Neither of these moves, on their own, is unprecedented in this conflict. What made this specific deployment stand out is the timing, landing directly in the same window as Iran's most serious diplomatic overture to date, rather than before it or well after it. Defense officials, speaking on background, offered a consistent explanation for that timing, one that fits a recognizable pattern in how the United States has approached negotiations with adversaries throughout its modern military history. The belief that a negotiating partner signaling weakness is precisely the moment to increase pressure, not ease it. On the theory that maximum leverage in any negotiation comes from demonstrating that the cost of continued resistance is only going up, never down, even as the other side is asking for room to talk. In this reading, the deployment was not a rejection of Iran's peace signal so much as a deliberate answer to it, an attempt to ensure that whatever pause or agreement eventually emerges happens on terms shaped by continued American military dominance rather than mutual exhaustion. This approach has precedent in how the United States has handled the closing stages of previous negotiations with adversaries under pressure, where the final terms of an agreement have often been shaped less by the diplomatic language exchanged at the table and more by which side held the stronger battlefield position at the moment talks concluded. The underlying theory is that an adversary who believes their position will only weaken the longer talks drag on has every incentive to conclude quickly and accept less favorable terms, while an adversary who believes time and continued pressure work in their own favor has every incentive to stall, by making unmistakably clear that time is not working in Iran's favor through a deployment rather than a statement. The Pentagon appears to be trying to compress that timeline and push Iran toward a faster resolution rather than a prolonged negotiation that might otherwise stretch on for months while both sides continue absorbing costs. This is the detail about timing that most coverage of this story is missing entirely. The additional carrier strike group repositioned into the region had reportedly been in a training and readiness cycle scheduled for redeployment on an entirely different timeline before Iran's back-channel signals reached Washington. Multiple defense officials indicated that timeline was accelerated specifically once the diplomatic feelers were received, not adjusted independently of them. That detail matters enormously because it changes this from a story about two unrelated tracks, ongoing military posture on one hand and quiet diplomacy on the other, happening to overlap by coincidence, into a story about a deliberate, direct response, using military deployment as the actual language of the reply to Iran's diplomatic opening, rather than a diplomatic reply of its own. Iran's response to the deployment has been, unsurprisingly, sharply critical, with officials publicly characterizing the move as evidence that the United States has no genuine interest in de-escalation regardless of what Iran offers. The public posture, however, sits in some tension with continued, quieter indications through the same regional intermediaries that the diplomatic channel itself has not been fully closed, suggesting Iran's own leadership may be reading the deployment less as an outright rejection and more as exactly what American officials privately describe it as, a pressure tactic meant to shape the eventual terms of any pause rather than prevent one from happening at all. Whether that read holds up depends heavily on what happens in the coming days, and it's a genuinely open question whether Iran's back-channel outreach survives a deployment of this scale landing directly on top of it. Let's talk about what this sequence tells us about how this administration is approaching the endgame of this conflict more broadly. Throughout this campaign, we've seen a consistent pattern where military pressure and diplomatic opportunity are treated not as separate sequential phases, first fight, then negotiate, but as simultaneous, mutually reinforcing tools. This deployment fits that pattern precisely. Rather than treating Iran's peace signal as a moment to ease off and test whether diplomacy could take over from military pressure, the response reinforced the message that diplomacy, if and when it happens, will happen entirely on terms set by continued and even increasing military dominance. That is a notably different approach than how conflicts have often concluded historically, where a clear diplomatic opening is met with at least some corresponding gesture of reciprocal restraint to keep the process moving. There's real strategic logic behind that approach, and real risk in it as well. The logic is straightforward. An adversary that believes resistance carries an ever-increasing cost, even while trying to negotiate, has every incentive to conclude negotiations quickly and on more favorable terms to the stronger party, rather than dragging talks out while hoping military pressure eases in the meantime. The risk is that a diplomatic partner whose genuine peace overture is met with escalation rather than any reciprocal gesture may conclude that offering concessions gains them nothing, and that further outreach is pointless, potentially hardening the exact defiant posture Iran's leadership appeared to be softening on before this deployment landed. That risk is not merely theoretical. Diplomatic history is full of examples where a party genuinely testing the waters for de-escalation, only to be met with a harder line in response. concluded that further outreach carried more domestic political risk than it was worth, closing a window that might not reopen easily, even if military pressure eventually forces the issue again later. Which of those two outcomes actually unfolds? Iran folding into a negotiated pause on American terms, or Iran concluding diplomacy is a dead end and reverting to a harder public posture, is likely to become clear within a fairly short window, given how directly this deployment landed on top of the most serious peace signal Iran has sent throughout the entire conflict. It's also worth considering how this moment is being read by allies and regional partners who have their own stakes in how this conflict concludes. Gulf state governments, several of whom facilitated the initial back-channel contacts between Washington and Tehran, are watching this sequence closely as a signal of how much influence their own diplomatic efforts actually carry once military and strategic considerations in Washington point in a different direction. A pattern where regional partners' careful, quiet diplomatic groundwork gets overridden by a rapid military escalation is one that could affect how willing those same partners are to continue serving as intermediaries in future rounds of this same process, an outcome that matters considerably given how much of the actual back-channel communication throughout this conflict has depended on exactly that kind of regional facilitation. There's a broader lesson in here as well for how other actors in the region, and beyond it, are likely to interpret America's approach to ending this conflict specifically. Governments watching from outside this immediate crisis, some of whom maintain their own complicated relationships with Iran, some of whom have their own adversarial relationships with the United States, are absorbing a clear signal about how this administration handles moments when an opponent shows genuine willingness to talk. If the lesson other governments take away is that offering a sincere peace overture gets answered with escalation rather than reciprocity, that has implications for how future adversaries in entirely different conflicts might choose to approach or avoid approaching the negotiating table with Washington down the line. Diplomacy, especially in a high-stakes conflict like this one, is never purely a bilateral exercise between the two immediate parties. It's also a demonstration to everyone else watching about how negotiation actually works with this administration in practice, and this sequence is likely to be studied closely well beyond the immediate context of Iran. Let me bring this down to what actually matters here beyond the strategic chess match. A negotiated end to this conflict, whenever it eventually happens, is going to depend enormously on both sides believing that continuing to fight costs more than agreeing to stop. This deployment is a direct, deliberate attempt to shape that calculation entirely in America's favor at precisely the moment Iran signaled it might be ready to make that calculation for itself. Whether that approach shortens this conflict by convincing Iran further resistance is pointless, or lengthens it by convincing Iran that diplomacy offers no real relief from military pressure, is the single most important open question hanging over this entire war right now. And it's one we're likely to get real clarity on faster than almost any other storyline we've covered on this channel. It's worth remembering, too, that ordinary people on both sides of this conflict have the most at stake in exactly this kind of moment, far more than the strategic calculations being made in Washington or Tehran. Every week this conflict continues, carries real human and economic cost across the region, from families near targeted facilities to global shipping, and energy markets already absorbing the ripple effects of months of sustained tension. A deployment like this one is being weighed by planners purely in terms of leverage and negotiating position, but the practical outcome of getting that calculation right or wrong is measured in how much longer ordinary people across the region have to keep living inside an active war zone. That's not a reason to root for one strategic approach over another from the outside, but it is a reason to take seriously just how consequential this specific moment, a peace signal met with a show of force, actually is. Before you go, I want to ask you two things directly. First, if this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening behind the headlines than the shorter clips circulating elsewhere, share it with one person trying to make sense of this conflict. That's genuinely the only way careful analysis like this reaches people instead of getting buried under louder, less careful content. Second, I want your read in the comments. Do you think meeting Iran's peace signal with a major deployment instead of a reciprocal gesture is smart, maximum leverage diplomacy? Or do you think it risks killing the best diplomatic opening this conflict has had so far? Drop your assessment below. I read every one of them, and if this video delivered real value, a like helps it reach people who need a clear-headed breakdown instead of speculation. Here's where this stands. Iranian officials, through intermediaries in Oman and Qatar, sent the most serious diplomatic signal of the entire conflict, indicating a genuine interest in a negotiated pause rather than the maximalist demands that had defined earlier attempts at outreach. Within roughly 72 hours, the Pentagon responded not with a reciprocal diplomatic gesture, but with the accelerated deployment of an additional carrier strike group and a heightened readiness posture for long-range bomber assets, a redeployment timeline that was reportedly moved up specifically in response to Iran's outreach, rather than independent of it. Iran's public response has been sharply critical, even as quieter back-channel contact through the same regional intermediaries reportedly continues, suggesting Iran's leadership may be reading the deployment as a pressure tactic rather than an outright rejection of diplomacy. Whether this approach succeeds in shaping a negotiated end to this conflict on American terms, or instead convinces Iran that diplomacy offers no real relief and hardens its resistance instead, is likely to become clear within days rather than weeks, making this one of the most consequential moments of the entire campaign so far. Stay locked in on this one, because how Iran answers this deployment may determine how the rest of this conflict actually ends.